Welcome to the debate. It is Monday, January 19, 2026. If the mood in Washington is tense, well, the mood in Brussels and Copenhagen is practically radioactive. We are, 48 hours past the Saturday announcement that has effectively rewritten the rules of the transatlantic relationship. The United States isn't just asking for Greenland anymore. It's leveraging the entire weight of the American economy to take it.
It really feels like the diplomatic equivalent of a grandmaster just flipping the chessboard because they didn't like the opening move. You know, we aren't just discussing tariffs or some real estate deal here. We are looking at the potential dismantling of the entire post-World War II security architecture. So, the central question we have to wrestle with today is, it's brutal in its simplicity. Does the strategic logic of securing the Arctic justify incinerating 75 years of alliance trust?
That is the question. Is this a necessary, albeit ruthless maneuver to secure vital assets in a world where the ice is melting and the maps are literally changing? Or is it a blunder that leaves the West fractured and vulnerable? I'm going to be arguing the former. I'll make the case that the strategic value of Greenland, specifically regarding rare earth minerals and the GI-UK gap, necessitates direct American control, and that when traditional diplomacy hits a wall, economic pressure is the only rational tool left to ensure national survival.
And I will be taking the other side. I'll argue that you cannot buy security by cannibalizing your own friends. Treaties rely on trust, not coercion. By categorizing our closest allies, France, Germany, the UK, the Scandinavians, as security threats just to justify these tariffs, the administration is doing the work of our adversaries for them. This isn't strength, it's isolationism masquerading as strategy.
So let's get into the thick of it. To really understand this, we have to look past the outrage you see on social media and look at the map. This isn't madness. It's a calculated response to a shifting reality. We're dealing with the most significant environmental shift in human history. The Arctic is melting, and this isn't just about rising sea levels, it's about access. Greenland is transforming from an ice sheet into a premier strategic asset. We're talking about the opening of new shipping lanes that could rival the Suez Canal, and more importantly, the exposure of what lies beneath all that ice.
You're referring to the mineral deposits, of course.
Exactly. And we need to be specific here so listeners understand the stakes. We aren't talking about gold or diamonds. We're talking about neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, and terbium. These are the vitamins of modern industry. You cannot build an F-35 fighter jet without them. You cannot build the guidance system for a cruise missile without them. You certainly cannot build the electric vehicle infrastructure the world is transitioning to without them. And right now, China controls the vast majority of the processing and supply. Greenland holds one of the largest undeveloped deposits in the entire world.
I don't dispute the geology. The Kvanefjeld deposit is massive. But geography doesn't excuse geopolitics. The resources are there, yes, but the method of acquisition is where this all falls apart.
But the method is dictated by the urgency. Look at the history. It informs the why now. During World War II, when Denmark was occupied by Nazi Germany, the U.S. didn't ask nicely for permission to use Greenland. We occupied it. It was the unsinkable aircraft carrier that protected the convoy lines. The administration's argument is that we are in a similar pre-war footing now. The president claims Europe is asleep at the wheel, barely surveilling the region, while Russia and China are moving in. The tariffs, 10% on imports from 8 specific European nations, are the leverage to force a transaction that permanently secures the American perimeter.
That's a compelling narrative if you believe that might makes right, but it completely ignores the mechanism of how modern alliances are supposed to work. You mentioned the pre-war footing. If we are indeed facing a threat from Russia or China, the absolute worst thing you can do is declare economic war on the people who are standing in the trench right next to you.
Unless those people are preventing you from reinforcing the trench?
But they aren't. That's the real tragedy of this. Let's look at the specific targets of these tariffs announced on Saturday. Denmark, obviously, but also Norway, Sweden, Finland, Germany, France, the Netherlands, and the UK. These are the bedrock of Western democracy. These are nations that have shed blood alongside American troops. To classify their exports as a threat to national security which is the legal justification being used here, is frankly insulting. It effectively tells London and Paris, you are no different than Beijing or Moscow.
I think that's an emotional reading of a transactional move. The administration views these nations not as enemies, but as blockers of a necessary realignment.
But look at the immediate trigger. European nations recently sent military delegations to Greenland. Why? To address American concerns. They were preparing for joint exercises, looking to set up permanent detachments to help surveil the GIUK gap, that crucial naval choke point. They were stepping up, yet the president interpreted these moves not as support, but as suspicious plotting. He twisted a gesture of burden sharing into a conspiracy theory to justify a land grab. I mean, that isn't strategy, that's paranoia.
Is it paranoia, though? Or is it a recognition that joint exercises are temporary, but sovereignty is permanent? Let's pivot to the legal framework, because this is where the rubber meets the road. We're operated under the 1951 Defense of Greenland Agreement.
Which has worked perfectly well for 75 years.
Has it? Or has it just not been stress tested? The realist perspective here is that the 1951 agreement is a relic. It is in essence a lease, a rental agreement. And in a world where the Arctic is becoming the next great game, rental agreements allow for ambiguity. Can Denmark veto a U.S. nuclear deployment there? Can the local Greenlandic government block a mining project that the U.S. deems critical for national defense? The answer is yes, and that ambiguity is a risk the U.S. is no longer willing to take. Ownership eliminates the veto.
But you're ignoring the massive autonomy the U.S. already enjoys. Let's get technical for a second. The U.S. operates the Pacific Space Base, formerly known as Thule. This isn't just a runway in the snow. This is the home of the 12th Space Warning Squadron. It houses the AN/FPS-132 upgraded early warning radar. It is the eyes of the U.S. missile defense system looking over the North Pole. We have that right now. The treaty allows for defense areas to be established virtually anywhere on the island if there is a mutual agreement.
If there is a mutual agreement, that's the catch.
A catch that has never been used to stop a critical U.S. security need. If the president wanted to expand the runway at Patufic or build a deep-water port in Nuuk to counter Russian submarines, he could have done it under the existing treaty. He could have framed it as a NATO victory. Look, our allies are letting us build more bases. Instead, he demanded the deed to the House. This suggests the motivation isn't really about the strategic utility of the land, which we already have access to, but about the political optics. It's a vanity project. It's about completing the deal that was rejected back in 2019.
I think you're underestimating the frustration with the status quo. In 2019, when the U.S. first floated the idea of purchasing Greenland, Copenhagen didn't just say no. They called it absurd. They mocked it. But from a purely strategic standpoint, if you are the United States and you see China calling itself a near-Arctic state, and you see Russia building nuclear-powered icebreakers, relying on Denmark, a country with a total active military of about 20,000, to protect a continent-sized island is risky. The argument is that we need title deeds, not leases. And since the carrot of money was rejected, the stick of tariffs is the only tool left.
And what a stick it is. Let's just talk about the weaponization of trade here. We are looking at a 10% tariff effective February 1st, less than 2 weeks from now, rising to 25% in June if no deal is reached.
It's a siege. I won't sugarcoat it.
It's a siege against our own treaty partners. The economic implications are staggering. We're talking about $1 billion blow to European exports. German cars, French wine, Danish pharmaceuticals, all suddenly 10% more expensive for American consumers. And let's be clear, it is the American consumer paying that tax.
Correct. It is economic coercion. It is the tariff weapon deployed against friends. But the administration's calculation, and it's a cold one, is that the pain is the point. It forces a decision. Yes, American importers pay more. Yes, prices go up. But in the eyes of the White House, this is the cost of doing business to secure a permanent strategic advantage. They are betting that the German auto industry and the French luxury sector will scream so loud that their governments will pressure Denmark to sell. If Europe won't sell, the U.S. will tax until the cost of not selling becomes higher than the cost of selling.
That is such a transactional view of the world. It assumes nations are just corporations that will fold if their quarterly earnings take a hit. It ignores national pride. It ignores the currency of international relations, which is trust. For the first time, Article 5 of NATO, the promise that an attack on one is an attack on all, is being conceptually inverted. Here, the one, the United States, is attacking the all. How do you maintain an alliance when the ringleader is holding the other members hostage?
I'm not sure the Article 5 argument holds water, because Article 5 is about external military threats. The administration is arguing that the refusal to allow American sovereignty over a critical flank is in itself a threat to American security. It's a redefinition, sure. But look at the domestic reaction. You expect Democrats to be up in arms, but look at the Republicans.
Exactly. It's not just liberal outrage. You have Republican Senator Tom Tillis coming out and explicitly stating that this divides NATO and isolates the U.S. But even more telling is the reaction from the European right. I mean, these are the politicians who usually idolize this style of America First politics. Alice Weidel of the AfD in Germany, Jordan Bardella of the National Rally in France. They are furious. Why? Because they are nationalists. They understand that if the U.S. can violate Danish sovereignty today, it can violate German or French sovereignty tomorrow. When you have lost your ideological allies abroad and your own party members at home, you have to ask if the strategy is sound.
Domestic criticism is expected when you break norms. But let's look at the geopolitical endgame. Who actually wins here? The argument for annexation is that a U.S.-controlled Greenland creates a fortress America. Imagine the map. The U.S. controls Canada's flank, the Arctic approach, and the North Atlantic. No adversary can breach that. It secures the rare earths independent of European bureaucracy. It secures the shipping lanes. It removes the middleman of Denmark from the security equation. From a sheer hard power perspective, isn't that a stronger America?
That is a compelling argument for a game of Risk. But in the real world, you have to consider the Russia factor.
Russia is always a factor.
Yes, but right now, reports coming out of Moscow say the Kremlin is authentically partying. And why wouldn't they be? Vladimir Putin's strategic goal for 25 years has been to fracture NATO. He wants to decouple Europe from the United States. By turning the U.S. into an unstable ally and a potential aggressor, this administration has handed Putin his greatest victory on a silver platter.
How so? If the U.S. takes the island, Russia's access to the Atlantic is choked off.
But at what cost? A unified front. A divided NATO where the U.S. treats French and German troops as suspects is infinitely less capable of opposing Russian expansion than a unified one. Russia is investing heavily in nuclear icebreakers. They are refurbishing old Soviet bases. If a crisis happens in the Baltics or in the High North, can the U.S. count on European support if we're simultaneously waging a trade war against them? You mentioned Fortress America, but a fortress with no friends is just a prison.
That's an interesting metaphor, but I would frame it differently. Russia respects strength. They respect territory. A U.S. flag flying over Nuke is a clearer deterrent than the coalition of European nations debating via committee how many troops to send for a training exercise. The administration is betting that American hard power, boots on the ground, flags on the pole, is worth more than the soft power of alliance cohesion. They believe NATO has become a paper tiger, and this move forces the tiger to grow teeth or get out of the way.
But hard power doesn't exist in a vacuum. The U.S. military machine relies on a global network. We need Ramstein Air Base in Germany. We need intelligence sharing with the U.K. We need the logistical support of the Netherlands. If you initiate a trade war and threaten a NATO member's territorial integrity, you force Europe to reconsider its dependency on the U.S. There's serious talk in Brussels about strategic autonomy, Europe unifying independent of the U.S. This spirals, and while we fight each other, Russia secures the routes and China buys up influence.
Let's circle back to the resources for a moment, because I think this is the pivot point. We mentioned the rare earths. It's not just about having them, it's about denying them to others. Currently, the U.S. is incredibly vulnerable to Chinese supply chain pressure. If Beijing banned rare earth exports tomorrow, our defense industry would grind to a halt. Is it not a dereliction of duty for a U.S. president not to use every tool available, even ugly ones, to secure those sources?
But Denmark is an ally. Denmark is not a rogue state. We could secure those resources through joint ventures. We could sign a binding treaty specifically for mineral rights. You don't need to own the land to buy the minerals. You just need a contract. But this administration sees a contract as weak and ownership as strong.
Because history shows that in times of global crisis, contracts can be broken. Sovereignty cannot. When the pandemic hit, borders closed, supply chains evaporated. The lesson learned was, if you don't control it, you don't have it. The geography is changing faster than diplomacy can keep up.
I'm sorry, I just don't buy that the urgency justifies this hostility. The idea that we need to annex a whole island, an island with its own people, its own parliament, to protect a base we already controlled is a stretch. It feels like a land grab dressed up as grand strategy, and the reaction from the Kremlin confirms it. They see this as the West eating itself.
That is the gamble, isn't it? Let's start to wrap this up because the implications are obviously still unfolding. From my perspective, the strategic realism view, we are entering a harsh new world. Relying on the goodwill of other nations, even friendly ones, for critical defense positioning is, well, it's an intolerable weakness. The tariffs are a blunt instrument, ugly, expensive, painful, but they are designed to achieve a permanent solution. American sovereignty over the Arctic flank. It's a move that prioritizes physical control over diplomatic niceties.
And from my perspective, the alliance integrity view, this move is a catastrophic miscalculation. It confirms the narrative of the U.S. as a bully, not a leader. By demanding territory under the threat of economic ruin, the United States risks creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where Europe unites against Washington for its own survival. We are leaving the United States isolated and the Arctic more vulnerable to Russian influence because we've shattered the unified front that kept the peace for 75 years.
It is a moment that will define the next century. Whether this results in a stronger American fortress or a shattered Western alliance, well, that remains to be seen.
Indeed. And it leaves us with the haunting question: can an alliance survive when its strongest member views its own partners as threats?
Thank you for listening to the debate. We will be watching the events of February 1st very closely.
Thank you.